The sun bled out over the Texas plain, painting the dust in shades of rust and dried blood. Out here, the land didn't care about your grief. It was a vast, uncaring expanse of thorn and stone, and it demanded a hardness most folks back east couldn't fathom. She stood on her sagging porch, a silhouette against the dying light, her hand resting on a post worn smooth by a different man's grip. The letters from back home were stacked inside on the rough-hewn table, each one a polished stone of regret. They'd all urged her to sell, to come back to civilization after the fever took her husband. "That land is cursed," one friend had written, the ink elegant, the sentiment cold. "It's no place for a woman alone." They had abandoned the idea of her long before they abandoned her letters. Now she was truly alone, a widow on a failing scrap of earth at the edge of nowhere. Her existence had shrunk to the rhythms of survival, drawing water, mending fences that seemed to break on their own, and listening to the coyotes sing at a moon that felt too close. The Comanche raids had moved further south, folks said, and the Apache bands had been pushed deep into the mountains or onto reservations far away. That's what the cavalry said anyway, when they occasionally rode through. Peace was a word they used, but the land itself felt like a held breath. She learned its sounds, the rattle of a snake, the sigh of the wind through the canyon, and she knew when a sound was wrong. It was a week later, near the dry creek bed at the north boundary, that she found the wrong sound. It was a low, pained groan, almost like an animal, but with a weight to it that made the back of her neck prickle. Her hand tightened on the handle of her water bucket. Every instinct, every whispered story of terror around a frontier hearth screamed at her to turn back, to fetch the heavy rifle from above the mantel. But another instinct, older and deeper, rooted her to the spot. It was the same instinct that had made her stay when her friend's words had turned to ash in her mouth. She moved toward the sound, her boots crushing the brittle grass. He was half hidden in the scrub, a shadow among shadows. At first, she saw only the dark pool seeping into the thirsty earth. Then she saw the leg, twisted wrong, and the ragged tear in his buckskin leggings. His face was turned away, dust-caked in long black hair. He was an Apache. Fear, cold and immediate, locked her lungs. Her eyes darted around, searching for others, for the ambush this surely was. But there was only the immense, silent pressure of the empty land. The man let out another shallow breath, a bubble of blood forming at his lips. He was dying. Not with the dramatic fury of the stories, but quietly, stubbornly, like the land itself was trying to reclaim him 1 inch at a time. She stood there for a long time, the war inside her louder than any battle cry. To leave him was to be what they all expected her to be, a sensible woman, a frightened woman. To help him was to betray every warning, to invite a danger she could not name. But to walk away from a dying man, even this man felt like surrendering the last piece of her own humanity. With a resolve that came from a place beyond thought, she set down her bucket. It took an hour of brutal, staggering effort to get him onto the old draft horse. His weight slumped against the animal's flank. He never fully lost consciousness. His dark eyes would flicker open, fixing on her with a terrifying, unreadable intensity, before fluttering shut again. The shack was too small for secrets. She laid him on the packed earth floor near the hearth, pushing aside her own rough-spun blankets. She worked with a methodical detachment, cleaning the ugly wound on his leg where the bullet had passed through, splinting it with straight sticks and strips of cloth torn from an old sheet. He watched her, his face a mask of stoic endurance, flinching only when the whiskey she poured onto the wound bit into his flesh. He said nothing. Not a word of thanks, not a cry of pain. His silence was more unnerving than any threat. She left water and a plate of beans by his side, retreating to the far corner of the room to sleep in her chair, her late husband's rifle across her lap. She didn't sleep. She listened to his breathing, each rasp a reminder of the volatile she had brought into her home. Days slipped into a strange, tense rhythm. He began to sit up, to feed himself. He moved with a predatory economy, even injured, every motion purposeful and silent. She would find him staring out the small window, his gaze scanning the horizon as if reading a text only he could see. One morning, she caught him studying the few things she owned, the iron skillet, the pattern on her lone china plate with the focus of a man memorizing a landscape for a campaign. She spoke to him sometimes, simple things about the weather or the stubborn old hen that still laid eggs. He never replied. His eyes, however, were always speaking. They held a history of mountains and war, of sun-scorched escapes and moonlit pursuits. He was no lost boy. This was a man, full-grown and hardened in a fire she could not imagine. A change came when the rider appeared. He was a cowhand from a distant spread, lost and looking for directions. The Apache had been outside, sitting against the shaded side of the shack, strength slowly returning to his legs. At the sound of the stranger's voice he had melted back inside without a sound, a ghost moving in daylight. The widow stood on the porch, her heart hammering against her ribs, talking to the cowhand about creek crossings and rock formations. Her voice felt too loud, too bright. All the while she was acutely aware of the presence just inside her door, a coiled stillness waiting in the dark. The cowhand tipped his hat, grateful, and rode off none the wiser. When she went back inside, the Apache was in his usual place, but his eyes were on her, and for the first time she saw something in them besides pain and assessment. It was a flicker of understanding, a shared secret. In that moment they were no longer just widow and Apache. They were accomplices. That night, as a hard wind whipped around the corners of the shack, he spoke. His voice was low, graveled from disuse, but the words in careful, halting English were clear. "You are alone here. It wasn't a question." "I am," she said, not looking up from mending a sock. "The men with the yellow stripes on their pants. They look for someone, a man of my people. They say he is like a ghost in the canyon, that he strikes and is gone. That he has taken many lives." He paused, the firelight carving deep hollows in his cheeks. "They say he is the most ruthless of all. That Texas has offered much money for his head." The darning needle stilled in her fingers. The wind moaned like a lost soul. She finally raised her eyes to meet his. The kindness she had shown, the risk she had taken, all of it curdled in her stomach. The stories flooded back, not as campfire tales, but as cold, hard reports she'd overheard at the trading post. Settlements found empty, patrols ambushed without a survivor, a trail of vengeance that stretched from the Rio Grande to the Red River, the most ruthless. She looked at the man whose fever she had cooled, whose hunger she had fed. She saw the fierce intelligence in his eyes, the body built for endurance and violence, the absolute lack of fear. The pieces, terrible and undeniable, clicked into place. She hadn't saved a wounded soul. She had salvaged a storm. He saw the realization dawn on her face. He didn't nod, didn't confirm it. He simply held her gaze, and in that silence was a confession more absolute than any words. The man known only as a phantom of death, the scourge the whole territory feared, was sitting on her floor, his strength returning with each passing hour. And outside, carried on that keening wind, came a new sound, the distant but unmistakable jingle of harness and spur. It was not the random approach of a single cowhand. It was the organized, metallic music of a cavalry patrol, and they were riding directly toward her lonely shack. The widow's blood turned to ice. Her eyes darted to the rifle above the mantel, then back to the Apache's impassive face. He had heard it too. A slow, deliberate smile touched his lips, a smile that held no warmth, only a challenge and a promise. The knock that came at her door was thunderous, shaking the very timbers of her fragile world. The thunderous knock seemed to shake the very dust from the rafters. In the stillness that followed, the widow could hear the rough snort of a horse and the creak of saddle leather. The Apache did not move from his place by the hearth, but his posture shifted, not into fear, but into a state of pure readiness. Every line of his body became like a drawn bowstring. His eyes, black and unreadable, locked onto hers, and in that look was a silent command, a question, and a threat all woven together. Her own breath felt like shards of glass in her throat. The space between the knocks stretched, taut and screaming. They were waiting for a response. To pretend no one was home was impossible. Smoke curled from her chimney, and the cowhand from days before could have spoken of her. Her mind raced, tumbling over itself. The rifle above the mantel might as well have been across a wide river. To reach for it would mean moving, would mean acknowledging the presence inside that was not supposed to be there. The man on her floor, this ghost of the canyon, gave the slightest tilt of his head toward the door. His meaning was clear. Answer it. Her legs, numb and heavy, carried her forward. She smoothed her worn apron with trembling hands, a futile gesture of normalcy. With one last glance at her uninvited guest, now just a shadow among the deeper shadows, in the corner she lifted the latch and pulled the door open just a crack. The light of the late afternoon was blinding, framing two cavalrymen in blue. The one in front was a sergeant, his face weathered into a permanent squint, his mustache thick with trail dust. His eyes swept past her, into the dim interior of the shack, with a practiced, penetrating gaze. "Afternoon, ma'am," the sergeant said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was polite but carried no warmth. "Sergeant Monroe, out of Fort Griffin. This here's Private Hodge. We're making a patrol, checking on the homesteads out this way." She nodded, forcing her voice to work. "I'm obliged." "It's quiet here." The words sounded absurd the moment she said them. The air was thick with the tension bleeding from the room behind her. "That's good to hear," the sergeant said, but his eyes kept moving, taking in the single room, the table, the cold hearth, the pile of blankets on the floor. "Had some trouble to the west, though. Apache, a small band, or maybe just one, they're not sure, raided a supply wagon. Killed 3 teamsters," he said it flatly, watching her face. "More'n killed, it was butchery." "The work of Goyal? You heard that name?" She hadn't, but the way he said it, with a mix of hatred and grim respect, told her everything. She shook her head, her throat too tight to speak. "The Mexicans call him Geronimo," the private, a younger man with anxious eyes, added almost unnecessarily. The sergeant shot him a silencing look. "He's a sickness. A devil, and he's clever. They tracked him north, toward these canyons. Then the trail just vanished." The sergeant's eyes finally settled back on her. "You seen any sign? Any strange tracks? A man traveling alone, maybe hurt?" The question hung in the air. She could feel the presence behind her like a physical pressure, a cold stone in the pit of her stomach. To lie was to become an outlaw herself. To tell the truth was to deliver death, both to the man inside and likely to herself in the chaos that would follow. The silence stretched a beat too long. "Ma'am?" the sergeant prompted, his politeness beginning to wear thin. "No," she said, the word tearing itself from her. "No sign. I keep to myself. Just trying to hold on to this land." It was the truth or a piece of it, and she clung to it. The sergeant stared at her for a long moment, his doubt plain. His eyes drifted again to the blankets on the floor near the fire, then to the second tin plate she had left drying on the crate she used as a washstand. A plate for one. A blanket pile for one, but 2 plates. "You're alone out here, then?" he asked, and the question was a trap. "My husband passed last spring," she said, and the real grief in those words gave her voice a solidity the lies lacked. "I'm sorry for your loss," the sergeant said, and he seemed to mean it, but his duty was a harder master than sympathy. "It's no fit country for a woman on her own, especially now. This Goyal, he's got a particular hatred for settlers, no reason to it. Just a taste for blood. He was trying to scare her, to see if her fear would break into a confession of something seen, something known." From the shadows behind her there was no sound. But she imagined she could feel the derision in the silence, a rebuttal to the sergeant's simple story. Her mind flashed to the man's leg wound, clean and precise. A bullet from a cavalry rifle, not the messy work of a wagon raid gone wrong. The stories were never just one story, she realized. They were whatever the teller needed them to be. "We'll water our horses at your creek, if that's all right," the sergeant said. It wasn't really a request. "We'll be riding a wider circle before sundown. You bolt your door tonight, you hear? If you see anything at all, you send word to the fort. There's a reward, a substantial one. Enough to buy a ticket back east and live comfortably. The reward." He said it as a kindness, a solution. But to her, it sounded like the final betrayal her friends had always expected of her. She merely nodded again, a stiff, wooden movement. The sergeant touched his hat once more, turned his horse, and led the private away toward the creek, the sound of their passage slowly fading. She stood in the doorway, watching until they disappeared into the brush, her body rigid. Only when the last echo of hoofall was swallowed by the wind did she close the door, leaning her back against the rough wood, as if barricading herself against the whole outside world. He was already standing. He had moved from the shadows silently, his injured leg bearing his weight with only a slight stiffness. He stood by the hearth, looking not at her but at the closed door, listening to sounds only he could decipher. The dying firelight played across the sharp planes of his face. Goyal, she whispered the name. It was a foreign sound on her tongue. He turned his head slowly. It is a name, they say. It is not who I am. His English was better than he had let on, the words chosen with care. They tell you I hate settlers. They tell you I kill for no reason. He took a slow step toward the center of the room, and the small space seemed to shrink around him. Do you know what my name means in the language of my fathers? It means one who yawns. A faint, ironic twist touched his lips. Not so fearful. Why are you here? She asked, her voice barely audible. Why my land? He considered her, his dark eyes seeing everything: her fear, her exhaustion, the stubborn set of her jaw that had kept her here when others left. Your man, he said, gesturing vaguely to the empty space of the shack. He built his fences across the old deer path to the spring. The one my people used when the world was green and the buffalo were thick as grass. This is not your land? It is land you are on. He said it not as an accusation, but as a simple fact, a truth so fundamental to him it needed no anger. I was not at their wagon. I was watching soldiers who were watching me. The bullet came from a ridge. I rode until the horse died, then I walked this place. He glanced around. It was a memory. A wrong turn on a right path. His story was so different, so specific. It didn't make him innocent. She knew that. A man didn't get a reputation like his from misunderstandings. But it painted the sergeant's certainties in shades of gray. He was a man, not a devil. A wounded animal driven to a place it remembered. They will come back, she said, or others will. They will not stop looking for you. He nodded, accepting this as another simple fact. The one with the stripes on his arm, the sergeant? He knows you are lying, her heart stuttered. What? How? He saw the second plate. He saw the way your eyes went to the shadows where I sat. He is a hunter. He sees signs. The Apache moved to the small window, peering out through a crack in the shutter. He left to water horses, yes, but also to look. To see tracks around the creek. To see if one set of footprints becomes two. A cold dread seeped through her. She had been so focused on the moment, on the words, she hadn't thought about the evidence. Her frantic trip to bring him here, his slow movements around the shack, they would have left a trail a blind man could follow. Then we have to go, she said, the words surprising her as much as him. He turned from the window, his expression unreadable. We? If they find you here, they will not ask gentle questions of me. The reward, it turns neighbors into hunters. I'm already an outcast. Helping you would just give them a reason. She was speaking quickly, logic and panic weaving together. And you can't run far on that leg. Not yet. A long silence filled the room, broken only by the spit of the fire. The mutual need, ugly and undeniable, lay between them. She needed him gone to save herself from the cavalry's suspicion. He needed time to heal, a hiding place they would not think to look in. There is a place, he said finally. A canyon fold deep, not on any white man's map, water there. It is 2 days' walk, maybe 3 for you. He assessed her, not as a woman, but as a piece of equipment for a journey. We would leave no trail they could follow. But to get there, we must cross open ground tonight under the moon. And if the sergeant is as good a hunter as I think, he will not be watering his horses for long. As if summoned by his words, a new sound carried on the wind, not the returning jingle of the patrol, but the lonely, echoing cry of a coyote. But it came from the direction of the creek, and it sounded once, twice, and then stopped. Too clean. Too patterned. The Apache's head cocked. All the softness vanished from his face, replaced by the ruthless focus the sergeant had described. It was the look of a man who had survived 100 ambushes. That is no coyote, he said, his voice a low murmur. It is a signal. They are not leaving. They are circling. He moved swiftly, snatching up the remaining blanket and her water skin. He tossed her a heavy shawl from a peg on the wall. Now? We go now. Or we die in this box they call a house. He blew out the single candle, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the embers in the hearth. The world outside the door was no longer just empty land. It was a chessboard, and the pieces were moving in the dusk. The widow stood frozen for one more second, the weight of every terrible choice pressing down. Going with him was madness. Staying was a death sentence. The coyote call came again, closer this time, from a different direction. They were already surrounded. With a final, desperate glance at the home she had fought so hard to keep, she pulled the shawl around her shoulders and followed the ghost of the canyon out into the gathering night. The night air was a slap of cold, tasting of dust and sage. The world outside her door was not the familiar one of crickets and soft darkness. It was a vast, open maw, every shadow a potential hiding place, every rustle of grass a footfall. He moved like a part of that darkness, a fluid silence that her own movements seemed to crash against. She stumbled after him, her boots catching on rocks she couldn't see, the blanket and waterskin he'd thrust at her feeling like absurd burdens. He didn't head for the creek or the trail. Instead, he angled sharply toward the broken, rocky spine of land that rose behind her shack, a place she'd always considered useless, good only for rattlesnakes and twisted juniper. "Keep low," his voice was a breath on the wind, not a whisper. Whispers carried. "Do not look back. Your eyes will reflect the moon." She obeyed, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The climb was brutal. Loose scree slid under her feet, and the sharp scent of crushed juniper filled her nose. He moved ahead, not helping her, but pausing often, a statue listening to the language of the night. When they neared the crest, he dropped flat, motioning for her to do the same. They crawled the last few feet on their bellies. From this vantage, the shack below was a dark smudge, the creek a silver thread in the moonlight. They were not alone. Near the creek, shadows detached themselves from the larger shadows. Two men on foot, moving with careful, deliberate steps, their rifles held at the ready. They converged on her home from opposite sides. The sergeant and his private. They had indeed been circling, the false coyote call setting a trap she had only just escaped. She watched, a cold knot in her stomach, as the private kicked her door open, the sound a faint wooden crack carried on the wind. The sergeant flowed in behind him. A long minute passed. Then lantern light bloomed in her window, a guilty yellow eye in the night. She could imagine it all, the two plates, the still warm hearth, the impression of two bodies on the floor. Proof of her lie. The sergeant would see it not as an act of mercy, but as collaboration. A settler woman consorting with the very devil he was sworn to destroy. The reward would now have her name sketched beside his in his mind. The Apache beside her made a soft clicking sound with his tongue. His eyes were not on the shack, but scanning the wider plain, the arroyos that cut through the land like black veins. "The others are still out there," he murmured. "They wait for us to run. They think we will go for the horse or the open plain." He pointed a slender, defined finger toward a deeper darkness to the north, a patch of land that seemed to swallow the moonlight. "We go there." Into the stone teeth. The descent was worse than the climb. He led her down a sheer face she would have sworn was impassable, finding holds and crevices with an instinct that seemed born of the rock itself. More than once, his hand shot out, gripping her forearm to steady her, his touch like iron, impersonal and sure. They hit the bottom of a narrow wash, a dry scar in the earth, and began to move north, the high walls closing around them. The world reduced to a slit of starry sky above and the crunch of their passage below. He set a punishing pace, his limp barely noticeable now, driven by a purpose that left no room for her exhaustion. Hours bled together, measured only by the slow wheel of the stars and the burning in her lungs. Just as she thought her legs would give way, he stopped, holding up a hand. He tilted his head, listening. From far behind them, back in the direction of her home, came a sound that was not of the night. A man's shout, angry and frustrated, answered by another. Then a single sharp crack that split the stillness, a gunshot. It wasn't the booming report of a rifle aimed at a target, but the flat, definitive sound of a pistol shot. A signal or something else. She sucked in a breath, her eyes wide. He looked back, his face a mask of stone, but she saw a muscle flex in his jaw. "They found nothing," he said, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. "Or they found something to make them angry. They will track us at first light. We have until then to vanish." He pushed on and she followed, the echo of that gunshot marching behind them. What had they found? Had they destroyed her home in their anger? The thought of her few precious things, her husband's book, Her mother's locket scattered or broken was a physical pain. That shack was all she had left of the life she'd built. Now it was just another piece of evidence in a hunt. As the deepest part of the night wore on, a strange camaraderie of fatigue settled between them. He began to speak in short, clipped sentences, not to comfort her but to instruct. Step on stone, not sand. The sand holds a shape. The stone forgets. See this bent grass? A deer 2 hours ago. We walk where it walked. The white men follow the easiest path. We follow the path that is not a path. His knowledge was absolute, born of a lifetime reading a text she had only ever seen as wilderness. It was a subplot of survival running parallel to the main chase, a quiet education in invisibility. He told her fragments, never whole stories. The man they call Goyal, he said once as they navigated a field of boulders. He fought for the right to bury his mother in the land of her birth. The soldiers said no. That was the first time they wrote his name in their books. Before that he was just a man. Another time, when she asked about the wound on his leg, the bullet was from a new rifle. One that shoots farther than a man can see? It is not an honorable way to fight. To kill a stranger from a distance you cannot smell or hear. His perspective was a lens that turned the world on its head. The ruthless killer was a son denied a burial. The advanced cavalry weapon was a coward's tool. Dawn was a gray suggestion in the east when he finally stopped in a tangle of ancient, gnarled manzanita that clung to a hillside. He pulled back a curtain of brittle branches, revealing a shallow cave, little more than a gouge in the rock, but deep enough to hide them from view. We rest here. The sun will be our enemy soon. Inside the cramped space, the air was cool and smelled of old earth. She sank down, her body trembling with spent adrenaline and fatigue. He took a position at the mouth, sitting cross-legged, watching the light slowly reclaim the land below them. The openness of the prairie gave way to a labyrinth of canyons, red rock walls glowing in the early pink light. His promised sanctuary lay somewhere in that maze. Why did you not kill me? The question left her lips before she could stop it, born of exhaustion and the surreal reality of her situation. When I found you, you could have. Or later, in the shack. It would have been easier than this. He was silent for so long she thought he would not answer. He kept his eyes on the awakening landscape. My grandmother, he said, his voice softer now, stripped of its warrior's edge. When the soldiers came to our village the first time, when I was a boy, she stood in front of our lodge with no weapon. Only her shawl. She spoke to them in our language, which they did not understand. They pushed her into the dust. An old woman. He glanced back at her, his eyes black pools in the dim cave. You did not push, you did not take the rifle from your wall. You gave water. In a world where they push old women into the dust, such a thing is not nothing. It was not forgiveness. It was not affection. It was a stark, brutal accounting of a single debt. In his eyes, she was not a friend, but a neutral party in a war, one who had for a moment chosen a different side. It was a fragile thread, but it was the only thing tethering her to safety in this dangerous man's presence. As the sun climbed, its heat beginning to bake the stone around them, a new sound drifted up from the canyon floor. The distant, rhythmic strike of shod hooves on rock. Not the careful search of two men, but the purposeful, spread-out advance of more. A lot more. The sergeant had called in his patrol. The Apache tensed, his head tilting like a valve. The sound was still faint, coming from the south, the way they had come. But then, from the west, another sound answered, the sharp, high whistle of a man calling to another. They were not just following a trail. They were methodically sweeping the canyons, a net drawing tight. He turned to her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something that might be concern in the depths of his eyes. They have brought many soldiers. And they have Tonkawa scouts with them. At her blank look, he clarified, his voice grim. Enemy tribesmen who hunt for the blue coats. They know the old ways. They will find this cave by midday. The sanctuary was still a day's hard walk away, across open, sun-blasted rock where they would be visible for miles. The net was closing and they were trapped in a stone pocket with the sun rising and the hunters multiplying below. The widow looked from his resolute face to the vast, beautiful, and deadly landscape, hearing the converging sounds of the hunt. Her fate was no longer just tied to this Apache's survival. It was bound to his next impossible decision. The sound of the hunt was a living thing crawling up the canyon walls. It wasn't just the clear, metallic noises anymore. It was the subtle scrape of a dislodged stone, the faint murmur of voices carried on a thermal, the uneasy whinny of a horse from some unseen draw. The Apache remained still as the rock around him, but his eyes never stopped moving, calculating distances, angles, the slow march of the sun. "The Tonkawa," he said, the word leaving a bitter taste in the air. "They will look for what is out of place." A stone turned the wrong way, a branch broken too high for a deer. He glanced back at her pale face in city-made dress, now stained with dirt and torn by thorns. "You are out of place here. Your scent is wrong. Your fear is loud." The words were not meant to wound, but they did. She was a burden, and they both knew it. The fragile thread of debt between them was stretching thin under the weight of imminent capture. "Then leave me," she said, the defiance in her voice surprising her. "You could vanish right now." "You said it yourself, I slow you down." For a long moment he just looked at her, and she saw the calculation in his gaze. It was the logical choice. The ruthless choice. The choice the sergeant would expect of the Phantom Goyal. Then his eyes flicked to the distant opening of the canyon, where a tiny line of blue figures had appeared, threading their way into the maze. "If I leave you, they will find you. And you will tell them everything you have seen, every crack in the stone we have used. They will have you point the way." He shook his head once, a final decision made. "We go up, where the horse cannot climb, and the Tonkawa man thinks only of eagles?" Going up meant leaving the scant shelter of the cave and scaling the sheer, sun-baked face of the canyon wall behind them. It looked impossible, a smooth cliff of red rock riddled with only the smallest imperfections, but he saw a path. He moved first, finding fingerholds and narrow ledges invisible to her, moving with a spider's surety. He would climb a short distance, then brace himself, reaching a hand down for her. Their progress was agonizingly slow, a scrape and a gasp at a time. The coarse rock tore at her hands, and the growing drop below yawned like a promise of an easier end. She did not look down. She looked only at his hand, at the dark, sure strength of it, and willed her own to reach. Halfway up, the world below erupted into clarity. A group of 4 riders, led by a man on foot wearing buckskins and a cavalry Tonkawa scout, entered the wash directly below their old hiding place. They moved with a predatory grace, the scout's head swiveling, reading the ground like a book. He pointed to the mouth of the small cave. One of the soldiers dismounted, rifle raised, and approached cautiously before ducking inside. He emerged a moment later, holding something up. It caught the sun, a small, metal button from her dress, torn off in the frantic crawl into the cave that morning. The scout took it, sniffed it, and said something to the sergeant, who had just ridden up. The sergeant's face, even from this terrifying height, looked grim and satisfied. He shaded his eyes and began to scan the walls. The widow pressed herself against the hot stone, her heart hammering so violently she was sure it would shake her loose. The Apache above her had frozen, becoming just another shadow in the rugged cliff face. The scout's gaze passed over them, once, twice. He was looking for movement, for the shape of a man. He did not see 2 desperate creatures clinging to the vertical world. But he saw the path. He pointed to the base of the cliff, to the faint scuff marks and dislodged gravel where their climb had begun. He spoke rapidly, gesturing upward. The sergeant barked an order. 2 of the soldiers raised their rifles, not aiming but ready. The other remained on his horse, a hand resting on the coiled lariat at his saddle horn. They were going to wait. They knew they had their quarry trapped on a wall with no escape. All they had to do was be patient, like cats at a mouse hole. Sweat stung the widow's eyes. Her arms trembled with a deep, burning fatigue. She couldn't hold on much longer. The Apache seemed to sense her limit. He looked up, then down, his options vanishing. Above them, the cliff curved outward in a final, impossible overhang. To the side, a narrow crack split the rock, leading diagonally across the face toward a chimney formation maybe 20 feet away. It was a path, but it was exposed. A traversing moved directly in the rifle sights of the men below. He locked his eyes with hers. There was no comfort in them, only a stark, shared truth. "You must walk," he whispered, the sound barely audible, "like walking on a street. Do not look at them. Look at the rock. Look at me. Think only of your next step. Before she could protest, he was moving, sidling into the crack, his body pressed flat against the stone. He inched along, his moccasins finding purchase on tiny edges. He did not look back. It was her turn. A sob caught in her throat. She could feel the weight of the stairs from below, could almost feel the crosshairs of the rifles settling between her shoulder blades. She forced one foot into the crack, then the other. She pressed her cheek against the hot, gritty surface and shuffled. A shout rose from below. They had been seen. The sergeant's voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the dry air. "Hold your fire. Take them alive. The woman is a conspirator." The words conspirator alive rang in her ears. Being taken alive now meant a trial, a cell, a rope. It meant the reward collected doubly. It gave her a final, desperate burst of strength. She focused on the Apache's back, a few feet ahead, moving with calm inevitability. The world narrowed to the scrape of her dress against the stone, the gasp of her breath, the inch-by-inch progress across the face of the abyss. A new sound joined the chorus, the whistle and crack of a lariat, thrown not to capture but to dislodge. The rope snaked upward, striking the rock near her feet with a dry slap before falling away. The soldier with the lariat coiled it for another throw. This time, the loop sailed higher, brushing against the Apache's leg. He didn't flinch. He kept moving, reaching the chimney formation and pulling himself into its narrow, vertical shelter. He turned and extended his hand toward her. She was only 6 feet away, but it was a gulf. The lariat whistled again. This time, the loop settled over her shoulder, loose for a moment before it would be jerked tight. In that frozen second, she did not think. She let go of the rock with one hand and grabbed the rough hemp rope, throwing it off her like a poisonous snake. The movement cost her balance. Her foot slipped. A scream tore from her lips as she began to fall backward into empty space. His hand shot out, not grabbing her flailing hand, but clamping around her wrist with a grip that felt like it could crush bone. Her body swung out and slammed against the cliff, the impact driving the air from her lungs. Dangling by one arm, the canyon floor spinning sickeningly below, she looked up into his face. Strain etched every line, but his eyes were fierce, focused. With a grunt of effort that came from the depths of his being, he began to pull, hauling her upward like a landed fish. She scrambled with her feet, found a ledge, and collapsed into the chimney beside him, a trembling heap of terror and relief. They were in a narrow, vertical shaft, shielded from the view and the ropes of the men below. But they were also in a stone prison. The chimney rose another 30 feet before opening to the sky. There was no other way out. The sergeant's voice, furious now, echoed up to them. "You're trapped. Send the woman down and we'll talk. You have my word." The Apache leaned close to her ear, his breath warm. "His word is worth less than the water in a mirage." He looked up, studying the chimney. "This is a place of my people." "A prayer place?" "The top is not the end." He began to climb again, bracing his back against one wall and his feet against the other, inching upward in the technique she had heard called chimneying. She followed, her body moving now on pure instinct, a dumb animal driven by the will to live. At the top, the chimney did not open onto a flat summit. It opened onto a slender, knife-edge ridge of rock that connected to the next canyon over. On the other side of that ridge, perhaps 100 feet across a dizzying gap, lay a secluded mesa, green with piñon and scrub, a hidden island in the sky. The promised sanctuary, so close, but the ridge was the test. It was less than a foot wide in places, eroded and treacherous. And on their side of it, waiting for them, was a sight that stole the last of her hope. 3 cavalrymen had dismounted and, following the scouts' guidance, had found a longer, more gradual road up the back slope of the canyon wall. They stood now, rifles aimed, blocking the path to the ridge. They had outflanked them. The sergeant and the others would be coming up the main trail behind them soon. The Apache and the widow stood on the tiny, broken platform at the top of the world, the wind whipping at their clothes, caught between 2 halves of the closing net. The lead soldier, a corporal with a nervous tick in his cheek, leveled his rifle. "Don't move a muscle, Geronimo." "It's over." The Apache slowly raised his hands empty. He stood tall on the precipice, the relentless sun etching him in light and shadow. He looked not at the soldiers but at the widow, and then past her, at the sergeant who was now cresting the rise behind them, his face flushed with effort and triumph. The sergeant grinned, a hard, victorious thing. "Told you we'd hunt you down." His eyes flicked to the widow, and the grin faded into something colder. "And you'll hang right alongside him for aiding a hostile." The Apache spoke then, his voice calm and clear, carrying over the wind. "You hunt a ghost, Sergeant, but you catch only a man and a woman who gave water to a dying one." He took a small, deliberate step backward, toward the very edge of the cliff. The mesa across the gap seemed to beckon, an impossible dream. "You want Goyal? Then you must follow where he goes." He glanced at her, a single, swift look that held a universe of meaning and apology, a challenge and a final, desperate question. He was going to make a run for the knife-edge ridge, a sprint across a tightrope with bullets as the only net. And he was asking her without words if she would follow. The soldiers tensed, fingers tightening on triggers. The sergeant opened his mouth to shout the order. The world held its breath on the razor's edge of the cliff. The Apache's step back was not a retreat. It was a gathering, like a spring coiling. The sergeant's shout of "Fire!" was lost in the whip crack of the wind and the sudden, explosive movement of the man they hunted. He didn't run for the knife-edge ridge. Instead, he dropped low and lunged not away from the soldiers, but directly toward the corporal with the nervous tick. It was so unexpected, so contrary to the logic of flight, that it froze them for a half-second. That was all he needed. He was among them like a dust devil, a blur of motion. A rifle barrel was grabbed and shoved upward as it discharged, the shot screaming harmlessly into the vast sky. An elbow found a throat, a foot swept a leg. It was not fighting to kill, but to create chaos, a screen of confusion and stumbling bodies on the narrow ledge. In the midst of it, his voice cut through to her, sharp and clear. "The ridge, now!" The widow didn't think. She ran. Not with his predatory grace, but with a wild, scrambling desperation, her eyes fixed on the slender line of rock that led away from the shouting, the cursing, the tangled blue uniforms. She heard the sickening crunch of a fist meeting bone, a man's cry of pain. She didn't look back. The ridge was under her feet, stone and gravel, so narrow she could see the deadly drop on either side. The world became a tunnel, the far mesa her only goal. Behind her the chaos resolved. The Apache broke free from the scrum, 2 soldiers on the ground, one clutching his arm, the other gasping for air. The sergeant and the remaining man had their rifles up, but he was already moving, sprinting after her onto the ridge. Bullets spanged off the rock around her, zipping past with waspish fury. One tugged at her sleeve. A scream lodged in her throat, coming out as a strangled whimper. She kept running, her arms wheeling for balance. He caught up to her in 3 great strides. He didn't try to pass. He ran just behind her, his presence a wall between her and the bullets. "Do not stop," he commanded, his breath hot on her neck. "Their fear of the height is greater than their hate for me." He was right. The sergeant, brave on solid ground, hesitated at the edge of the terrifying ridge. He fired one more shot, but it went wide, his balance precarious. He bellowed for them to halt, but the order was swallowed by the abyss. They reached the other side, tumbling onto the solid, blessed ground of the hidden mesa. She collapsed, her lungs burning, her body trembling uncontrollably. He stood over her for a moment, looking back the way they had come. The soldiers were a cluster of blue on the far side, gesturing angrily, but making no move to cross. The ridge was their border. It was a declaration, "Follow if you dare." None of them did. He turned and offered her his hand. She took it and he pulled her to her feet. Without a word, he led her inland, away from the edge. The mesa was a secret world, dotted with pinyon trees and ancient stunted junipers. There was a seep of water from a mossy crack in a rock wall, forming a small, clear pool. They drank deeply, the water cold and tasting of stone. For 3 days they rested in that high place. He hunted rabbits with a snare made from strands of her torn hemline. He showed her which berries were safe to eat. The relentless chase was over, replaced by a wary, exhausted peace. The soldiers did not come. The ridge had been a psychological frontier they could not cross. On the 3rd evening, as the sun painted the mesa in gold, he spoke. "You cannot go back, not to that life." The man with the stripes on his arm will have your name on a paper. Your friends, he used the word with a faint, knowing edge, they will not stand for you. She knew he was right. The woman who had lived in that shack was gone. She had died somewhere on the cliff face, leaving behind someone harder, someone who knew the taste of fear and the price of a single act of mercy. Where will you go? She asked. He gazed north, toward a haze of purple mountains. There are still places, not many, but places where a man can breathe. My people are scattered, but some are there. He looked at her, his face softer in the twilight. You saved a life. In my way, I will honor that debt. There is a town. 2 weeks' walk to the northeast. It is a mining town, rough, but new. They ask few questions there, a woman who can work, who does not speak of the past. She can make a new story. He spent the next day teaching her how to get there, drawing maps in the dirt, naming landmarks she would need to find. He gave her his knife, a wicked, beautiful thing of flint and wrapped leather, for the path. And for remembering, on the morning of the 5th day, they stood at the northern edge of the mesa, where a steep, hidden trail led down into a new set of canyons. The moment of parting had come. The vast, indifferent land stretched before them, holding different futures. I do not know your name, she said suddenly, realizing the strangeness of it. He considered this. In the tongue of my mother, I am called Cochet for the Red Canyon hawk, and you? She thought of the name her friends back east used, the name of a woman who belonged in parlors. It no longer fit. I do not know yet, she said honestly. But I will find one. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. He nodded once, a gesture of deep respect. Then he turned and started down the trail, moving with the sure, silent grace that was his alone. Within moments, the rocks and shadows swallowed him, as if he had never been. The widow, the conspirator, the woman without a name watched him go. She felt a profound emptiness, but not of loss. It was the emptiness of a room swept clean, ready for new things. She touched the flint knife at her belt, then turned her face to the northeast, toward the rough mining town and the promise of a story she would write for herself. She walked for many days, using the skills he had forced her to learn. She walked until the memory of the sergeant's furious face faded, replaced by the rhythm of her own steps. She arrived in the town of Silver Creek as the first autumn snow dusted the mountains. It was a loud, raw place, full of men who had past they didn't discuss. She found work in a boarding house run by a tired, kind-eyed woman who had also arrived with nothing but a determined look. No one asked about her previous life. In a place built on forgetting, her silence was normal. Over time, she heard whispers. Stories about the ruthless Apache war leader Geronimo, who continued to elude the entire U.S. cavalry in the distant deserts. They spoke of him with fear and a strange, grudging awe. She would listen, her hands never pausing in their work of kneading dough or mending a shirt, a private smile touching her lips. They did not know the man who had taught a lonely widow how to walk without leaving a trail, who had honored a debt with a knife and a map to freedom. One evening, a traveling newspaper came to the boarding house. A story on the front page told of a tense standoff somewhere far to the south, of negotiations and broken promises. It mentioned the name Goyal. She read it by the firelight, then folded the paper and used it to start the next morning's stove. The past was a country she had left behind. It held no power over her here. She had saved a life, and in return that life had saved hers. Not just from the cavalry, but from the slow death of abandonment and regret. On the high, lonely mesa, between the stone teeth of the canyon, she had been given a second chance. She was no longer a widow abandoned by her friends. She was a woman who had walked a ridge between two worlds and had chosen to keep walking into her own future. The land was still vast and uncaring, but she was no longer afraid of its expanse. She had learned its language, and in that knowledge she had found a home.